even politicians are beginning to see sort of writing on the wall, and are beginning to become quite interested in what exactly are we going to do about this. And that's a problem for everyone. It's a conversation that we need to take to a much higher level, I think. Well, for many years, I ran a small software company here in Silicon Valley, and I gradually became more and more interested in this topic, in part because I saw what was happening in my own small business. A lot of jobs were disappearing. And this was back in 2007, 2008, and in 2009, I published my first book on this topic, and then gradually, as that book kind of gained traction and people became aware of it, I got the opportunity to write the second book, Rise of the Robots. And since then, I've really been spending a lot of time talking about this issue and also thinking about it.
What do you think is on the horizon with AI in the future?
Right. So my central argument is that artificial intelligence has reached a point where it's really going to become a substitute for a lot of human thoughts. So it's what we're going to see is the automation not just of muscle power, which we've seen in the past, but really of brain power. You know, computers are quite literally beginning to think, at least in a limited way. And I think that really the central technology that's really driving this is machine learning. It's algorithms that can look at data, and based on that, it can learn. And what that means is that this technology is finally beginning to compete with our core competence, the thing that really sets people apart, right? I mean, you might ask the question, well, we've had all this technological progress for centuries, since the Industrial Revolution. Why aren't we already unemployed? And I think that the answer to that is that we have this ability to think, to adapt, to learn, to do new things. That's what so far has allowed us to stay ahead of technology. But now the technology is beginning to compete directly in that area, directly with that thing that really sets us apart. And I think that that is quite different. And that's the thing that I think is going to be quite disruptive in the coming decades. So my expectation is that maybe within the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, we are going to see a big disruption. A lot of jobs are going to disappear, and it's going to be a lot of jobs that we generally don't normally associate with the idea of robots or automation. It's going to be skilled jobs, white-collar jobs, jobs done by people with university degrees. It might be, doctors, radiologists, and lawyers, and journalists, and people like that, as well as, of course, all the more less skilled jobs as well, things like driving vehicles. So I anticipate that this is going to be a big disruption. There are certainly people that disagree with that, people that think this time is not different, that it's the same old story again and again. But I would argue that it is true that so far we've always been able to adapt to technology, but there's no economic law that says that will always be true. I mean, at some point, technology could reach the point where it's really going to begin to displace us on a very broad basis. And I think we're getting very, very close to that point.
What are counter-arguments that critics often use against this?
Right. I mean, the most important argument that people who are critical of this whole idea will make is that there is a lot of historical evidence to suggest that people always adapt. I mean, the classic example that you can look at is the mechanization of agriculture. It used to be that most people worked on farms. Now in the United States and in other advanced countries, it's maybe 1 or 2% of our workforce is working in agriculture. So millions and millions of jobs were lost, and people did move on to other things. They moved to manufacturing, and then later on, manufacturing is also automated to a significant extent, or offshored to places like China. And now everyone works in the service sector. So people who are skeptical will certainly point to that and say, look, it's always worked out in the past. It's just going to work out again in the same way. My argument against that is that, well, we're running out of new sectors that can absorb people, right? I mean, right now, most people work in that service sector, but that's also going to automate. Technology is coming for that sector, and then where are people going to go? I think it's also about the nature of the work. Most people still do things that are relatively routine and repetitive and predictable. Most people come to work and they do the same kinds of things again and again. All that kind of work is going to disappear.
You also wrote about a perfect storm that may happen. Can you What is this exactly?
Right. I worry about a perfect storm because the technological disruption that I'm thinking about here is going to unfold over the next few decades. And of course, other things are going on as well. We have climate change happening. In Europe, you've got an enormous problem with migration now. I mean, these are all things that are happening all at once. And the problem is that they're going to interact and impact each other and maybe even make each other worse. You know, as people are fearful of losing their jobs and becoming unemployed, they're going to be a lot less focused on things like climate change. They're going to be, you know, culturally more conservative, so they're going to be more opposed to migration than they might be normally too. So all these things relate together and are going to, you know, evolve into bigger problems. So I think it's very important to take a kind of a holistic view and realize that if you're worried, for example, about climate change, you should also be worried about inequality. You should also be worried about the fact that technology over the next couple of decades could really reduce economic security for a lot of people, because as that happens, those people are no longer going to be on your side and willing to fight to do something about climate change because they're going to be focused on their immediate problems. So it's really important to sort of consider all of these things together and how they potentially could interact. I look at what's happened with climate change as kind of a preview of what is likely to happen with this economic and technological issue as well. And it's a bit scary because you know, with climate change, you've got a very broad consensus. I mean, almost all the scientists are in full agreement about what's going on with climate change. But still, even given that, we haven't really been able to do much. Now, the thing that I'm talking about with technological disruption and job displacement, we don't have that consensus. There's still a debate going on. And I'm on one side of it, and there are many other people who feel differently. So clearly, we're not even as far along in terms of reaching that broad consensus that would allow us to take action. So there are good reasons to worry a little bit that we're not going to be able to move quickly enough to keep up with the pace of disruption as it occurs.
What if we just continue in a kind of business as usual scenario?
I think if we just continue this, you know, as things are, the best we can hope for is that things just become more unequal, that wages continue to stagnate here in the United States and in other countries. Many people feel that they're being left behind, and of course that will lead to political disruption. And we've already seen, you know, we've got a president that many people didn't expect to have. We had Brexit. These are both things that, to some extent, have been driven by this technological progress and by the fact that a lot of people feel they're left out, they're left behind, they're not better off than they used to be, and they're right, they're not. I mean, you know, wages have been stagnant. As that gets worse, we're going to see more disruption, and that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, of course, is that we really end up with mass unemployment. You know, we end up with lots and lots of people literally without jobs, and I'm not going to say with any certainty that I think that will happen, but it's definitely possible. I mean, it's a possibility that we need to, I think, take seriously, and perhaps the likelihood is that it's going to turn out somewhere in between those extremes, you know, somewhere on that continuum. And so we may well end up with significant levels of unemployment, at least in some areas and some groups of people, even as, you know, overall inequality continues to increase.
Isn't this vision of the future happening already?
Yeah, I mean, already it is happening. And as I said, it's playing out in terms of disruptions and political upheaval that we're seeing already that I think will get worse. And that's something to really worry about.
What can individuals do in light of these scenarios?
Well, you know, there are two things. In terms of positioning yourself to be relatively safe from all of this, the best things you can do is avoid a job where you're doing something that is routine and repetitive and predictable, right? You don't want to be coming to work and doing the same kinds of things again and again. If you've got a job that you feel is boring, then that's probably a warning, right? That you know, what you're doing could very well be threatened. So the best things to be doing are things that involve genuine creativity, where you're coming up with new ideas, building something new. Things that really involve lots of deep interaction with other people, where you're building relationships, maybe forms of empathy like a nurse or a doctor might have, or in the business world, really working with clients and building those strong relationships. And a third area that seems to be relatively safe are skilled trade type jobs that really require lots of mobility and dexterity in unpredictable environments, things like electricians, plumbers, these kinds of things. It's going to be really hard to build a robot in the foreseeable future that's going to do this type of work. So if you're doing something that's very unpredictable and non-routine and requires some level of skill, then that's going to be relatively safe. But all of these things I'm thinking in terms of the next few decades. Once we go beyond that, there's really nothing that you can say is completely safe. I mean, in my book, Rise of the Robots, I give examples, for example, of creative algorithms. They're already building algorithms that are exhibiting some level of creativity, right? There are computer programs that have written original symphonies and do electronic design work and paint original works of art and things like this. So computer creativity is something that's already happening. It's obviously going to get better. It's not impossible that 20 years from now, the most creative, quote, brain on the planet might be a machine and not a human being.
Despite of all these downsides, isn't it also possible that the future is actually much better than today?
Right. I mean, there is a very utopian way that you can imagine all of this playing out. And it's true. We might work less, or at least we might work less at things that we don't like doing, things that are boring or dangerous or dirty. We won't have to do those things. We'll have more time for leisure, right, to do things that are really important to us, more time with our families and so forth. And that's all great. In fact, that's a vision that John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, he had it all the way back in 1930. He wrote an essay entitled Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He was thinking 100 years in the future, and he imagined a world where people might work only 15 hours a week. And the rest of the time we would do, whatever we felt was rewarding. And that vision is, I think, a great one. That's something that we should sort of strive for, but the reality is that I think that happens only if we take explicit action. If we just let things play out, that we don't seem to arrive at that point. And the reason is that things will become too unequal, and people will be left behind. And rather than everyone working 15 hours a week and having a good life, we'll have a few people that do extremely well, and everyone else is kind of left behind. And that's one of the reasons that I've argued for policies like maybe a basic income, a guaranteed universal basic income that would make sure that we include everyone in this positive story, this utopian story.
Is this up to governments?
Ultimately, I think a policy like a guaranteed income is going to be up to government. I mean, you've got to have some kind of a central authority to manage that and to distribute the income and to levy the taxes that are going to be required to pay for it. So I really don't think this is a problem that can be solved by the market or just by the private sector. Definitely there's a role for people in the private sector, but a big part of that role is going to be supporting policies that will lead to a positive outcome here. Well, the most important thing that an individual can do is really understand how dynamic the future is going to be and position themselves for a lifelong learning process. And if you ask what should your kids learn, well, I would say your kids should learn to learn. I mean, they should really embrace that ideal that throughout my entire life I'm never going to stop learning, and for a child the most important thing is to learn to love that, so that they're going to have to do it, so they better learn to enjoy it, right? And that's true for those of us that are older too. I mean, it's going to mean embracing that attitude. So that's the most important thing we can do as individuals, and also try to move into areas that are more creative or involve more interaction with people, so that we can sort of protect ourselves from this big trend that's going to be coming at us in terms of more routine things being automated. But the second thing that's critically important is having an open mind about what this means for society. I mean, it's great to talk about what can I do for my kids, and so forth. That's great, but we know that these trends are going to be so powerful that some people are going to be left behind, That's going to be a problem. So we need to have policies to deal with that. And that means being a bit open-minded about possibilities like a guaranteed income, things that are admittedly radical, right? They're not things that are conventional. They're not things that have been tried before. They're not things that are normal. They're things that people really have a objection to in many cases, but I think that that's what it's going to take. We're going to have to do things that haven't been done before, and it's really important that people have an open mind about that. This does impact everyone at every level because the economy needs consumers, right? So it's not just about certain people not having a job or an income, and those people, well, too bad for them. Those people are not going to be buying anything, okay? When that becomes a lot of people, when it becomes maybe half of people, then that's a huge problem for the economy, right? You know, a market economy, capitalism depends on consumers. It depends on people that have got the income and the confidence to buy the products and services being produced. Businesses have got to have customers. So ultimately, no matter how wealthy you are, how successful you are, you're selling something to someone else, and there have got to be people out there that can buy that. And if there aren't, we're going to run into a big problem. So the reason I emphasize that is that I want everyone to feel that they've got a vested interest in this, you know, and they do. You know, this is something that will impact everyone, not just in terms of the disruption to society. Even if you can, you know, build a fence around your house and be safe somehow from everything that's happening, the economic tornado that's potentially going to come will still impact you. So you know, everyone has a vested interest in making sure that we adapt to this and solve these problems. I was just in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago talking to some people from the House of Representatives about this. And they're very interested in this. So even politicians are beginning to see sort of writing on the wall, and they're beginning to become quite interested in what exactly are we going to do about this. And that's a problem for everyone. It's a conversation that we need to take to a much higher level, I think.